There has been a bunch of new changes to some of the DLC incantations. Roughly 9 of them have actually been buffed, and I was planning to actually redo the entire ranking video again of all the DLC incantations, but being that only like a third of them have actually been changed, I'm just going to talk about these 9, and I'll just rank them from worst to best and put them in their own tier list. Anyway, let's just get started. To start off with, at the bottom, the Watchful Spirit spell. This actually did get an improved to tracking as of the recent patch, which I don't know why they only made this change. Like, how do you use this spell and look at it and be like, yep, the only thing that it needs is a bit more tracking. And it's completely ignore the fact that it has a long casting animation, does horrendous damage, has slow travel speed, only shoots at like 4 projectiles over a period of like 10 seconds. Like, there is almost nothing good I can say about this spell. This could have been like the phalanx equivalent of like the holy types of spells, but it's just not. The projectiles need to move a lot quicker, they need to shoot out at a faster pace as well, and there needs to be like a lot more than just 4 projectiles. SPIRA has now got an increase to attack speed, so when you continuously hold on to the attack button, it just shoots out a bit faster than beforehand, which is nice, but I still would never really like to use this spell, because the damage still isn't there. You can't move around while casting it, you get no hyper armor throughout the animation, and it's still a pretty expensive spell as well. 48 faith requirement, 2 spell slots, and 10 FP per cast, which 10 FP doesn't sound like much, but with how quick you can cast these spells, it ends up tallying up to be a really high amount. This spell potentially needs to have like a wider AoE, and maybe a bit of hyper armor. Minor Erdtree now heals for a little bit faster. It went from 24 HP per second to about 35 HP per second, and it still lasts the same 30 seconds. Now, unfortunately, it still is not affected by the Old Lord Talisman, so you can't really improve that amount. So it's just going to heal you for like roughly 1000 HP, which for a health regen spell, it's not too bad, because the benefit of health regen spells is that they don't scale of anything. You don't even need to have much faith or have an upgraded seal just to benefit. But with this spell, it has a 70 faith requirement, and at these higher levels of faith, you could just use something like heal from afar or Erdtree heal, and you could heal for like twice the amount of health in an instant, and also in a much wider AoE. This spell needs to have less requirements, a wider AoE, and heal for like twice the amount. Like, this thing should be healing for like 2000 HP over 30 seconds, which is like an entire health bar at like roughly 60 vigor. The Land of Shadow spell did actually receive a tracking buff, which definitely was needed because it is like a sniping type of spell. It can hit at very far distances, and having better tracking is going to be beneficial. Now, my problems with this spell is that it still has a very long animation, and it consumes a lot of FP. Like, I don't mind the fact that it does really poor damage, but if you want to use sniping types of spells, there are other ones that can do just as much damage, consume less FP, and are just faster as well. This spell also does get like an AoE explosion at closer range, but if you wanted to use like a close range AoE spell, there are like other ones that could just do it better. So like, it does a bunch of different things, but like nothing really that good. Hopefully they can change the animation to where it's like a lot faster, and maybe make it only consume 30 FP. Maybe that would make it pretty annoying in PvP, but it still needs to get a change. The Furious Blade of ANSBACH has now been fixed to where it does actually get a lot of bleed buildup, and it also has received an increase in damage. Now, the blood loss buildup is actually very good. When it's uncharged, it does roughly 180 bleed, and when fully charged, does roughly 250, which most bosses have around 400 to 500 bleed. So just using the attack a couple times is going to proc bleed on almost every single boss. But the major downside is that the damage is still very poor. And honestly, I wouldn't have that big of a deal with the damage if it just had a lower arcane requirement, because it has a 27 arcane requirement, and if I'm going into a lot of arcane, I'm more likely to not already have a bleed type of build, so I don't really benefit much of using this spell. I kind of wish it was like a bleed type option for faith-based builds, but like, all the damage is coming from the bleed, which bleed is nice to have, but if it's your only source of damage, it's not that reliable. Just one singular catch flame does like more damage than the entire combo of the Furious Blade of ANSBACH, and it's going to be a much longer animation, consume more FP, and you also just don't get hyper armor as well, which is honestly not that big of a deal because the spell does lunge in very far. So I don't mind the skill gap there of just being able to use it at further distances and like lunge into your opponent and not have to rely on hyper armor, but the damage needs to be improved. Like, people want to use the cool stuff, just make the cool spells like the best spells, why not? I don't have to keep recommending Catch Flame as like a close range fire option. I want something different to use. Divine Beast Tornado did receive a bunch of different buffs. It now actually gets more damage. Enemies that get hit with a fully charged version now actually get sent flying into the air. And the Tornado is less likely to actually disappear when it hits certain types of terrain. Now, all these changes are great. It makes it do respectable damage. The spell can go pretty far, and against these smaller enemies, it can just like stun lock them. You can just repeatedly use it over and over again. Now, unfortunately, you can only like toss enemies into the air when it is fully charged. When it's uncharged, it's practically useless. It is not that good of damage, and it hardly even staggers enemies as well. And in terms of the damage when fully charged, it's still not that great. A fully charged Pest Thread Spears will just do more damage. even against those really small enemies, and against larger enemies, it's not even close, and it just does do it in a faster animation. But obviously, Divine Beast Tornado does have the use against staggering the smaller enemies. Now, it still needs to get changed in my opinion, and I think the biggest one is probably giving it Hype Armor and having like the start of the animation get a hitbox, because as you're conjuring up that wind, that whole animation doesn't actually stagger enemies or do any types of damage. If they could make it to where it does get a hitbox and potentially stun lock to where like the follow-up attack is guaranteed, that would be nice, or potentially just make the animation faster. But as it stands right now, if I did want a spell that can like send enemies flying, I would use something like Burno Flame, and if I wanted a good physical projectile option, I would just use Pest Thread Spiz. The Roar of Regalia now actually does get a bunch more damage and a bunch more stance damage. Now before the patch, it only did like about 20 stance damage, and it was just on like the last and final roar, but now it does do stance damage throughout the entire animation, and when fully charged, it is roughly 42 stance damage, and the total overall damage itself is a lot better, but it's not going to like melt and shred enemies' health bars. If you think it's going to be comparable to things like Dragon Claw or Dragon Maw, it is not going to be like that. Even Grail's Roar actually can just do more damage, and that one does give you the benefit of a debuff as well. But this spell does have much better stun locking potential, and it is very cheap as well. So if you did want like a short range stun locking option that can do some nice stance damage, you could just use this spell. It might combo in nicely if you have like spirit summons. A couple of things that I would like to get changed about it is one, definitely give it Hype Armor because you can still get staggered out of it, and probably just give it like an additional effect similar to how Grail's Roar can debuff enemies to make them take more damage and do less damage. If this thing could like boost your defenses or like boost the damage of like your bear based sources, which there aren't many in the game, but it would be nice. The Rain of Fire spell, which was once a joke, is now an actual respectable spell. Because of this recent patch, it now just does a bunch more damage. It has better hit detection, and the actual attack comes out a bit faster as well. Now, still not going to be doing the most amazing amounts of damage, but the whole purpose of this spell is to be able to hit enemies at further distances and just do like a nice amount of damage over time, especially against those larger types of bosses. Being that it constantly rains fire for about like 5 or so seconds, you could just use the spell at the beginning of the fight and then just combo in your other types of spells or like combo in your weapon attacks, and it could just work very viably that way. Because using it throughout the boss fight is probably not going to be the best option, as it still has a longer animation, and you do want to get it off fully charged because using the uncharged version doesn't really seem as reliable and not really worth the FP cost. And also, once again, if you are at closer ranges, I think Burno Flame is the better option. This one can just do way more damage for a quicker animation, and this is going to be a lot more consistent. But Rain of Fire does have its use in this game because there are plenty of different things that can help boost the damage of the spell. Now, as for the incantation I think benefited the most out of this entire patch, it's going to go to Rotten Buttonflies. It now does a whole bunch more rot buildup, does get a larger AoE, and the damage explosions do come out a bit faster as well. Now, obviously, this spell is going to be comparable to Scarlet Aeonia, as it does get the same FP cost, similar animation speed, and basically the same requirements. But I think Scarlet Aeonia is still going to be better against those smaller types of targets, whereas Rotten Butterflies is better for the larger types of ones. Because against smaller enemies, Scarlet Aeonia is going to do more damage and just do more rot buildup too. Because Rotten Butterflies is a bit more RNG heavy, as it does cover all these explosions in a really wide AoE, and the enemies have to get hit by the butterflies just to benefit, and if they don't get hit by many butterflies, they're not going to get hit with that much rot buildup. Sometimes you could actually hit for roughly like 600 to 700 rot buildup, but sometimes you can only hit for like a couple hundred, whereas Scarlet Aeonia is like a consistent like 700 rot buildup, which is basically like an instant rot proc on almost every enemy in the game. But Rotten Butterflies against larger enemies does make it do more damage, and it can actually do upwards of like 1600 rot buildup against every single one of these like large bosses, especially dragons that typically have higher rot resist. It is going to instantly proc it, and it's going to be the 30% version of rot as well, which is basically the same as Scarlet Aeonia, and it only takes up 1 spell slot, which if that's a big deal to you, then Rotten Butterflies just might stay on at all times. But for me personally, I only really use like a handful of spells, and in a game where spell slots are tied to items and you can get a whole bunch of these really easily, it's not that big of a deal. Now for me personally, these spells kind of just lost a little bit of its use due to the hefty rot pot existing, because typically it was only the spells that did 30% rot damage over the 90 seconds, and all the other sources only did 15% damage, but now the hefty rot pot also does a 30% damage, and it's going to be in a quicker animation, doesn't cost FP, and these things are very easy to farm as well. So these might just be better to have against most types of bosses, but obviously the spells look cooler, they can do more damage, they are going to do it in a much wider AoE, especially if you're using Rotten Butterflies. If you want to clear out an entire room of enemies and proc rot instantly, you can definitely use this one. But it honestly doesn't matter which one you use, every single one of these are really good, and I definitely think Rotten Butterflies was deserving of the #1 spot today. Anyway, that is the video now done and completed. Tomorrow's video will be about the sorceries. I'm going to go rank all the ones that did get buffed from worst to best, and include the ones that did get nerfed, like Impenetrable Thorns as well. So if you are interested in that, please do subscribe, and also do follow me on Twitch as well, because I'm live there every single day doing a bunch of challenge runs, so definitely give me a follow there. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.